the most important question in the worldwide art market. Is it genuine or is it fake? When a forgery is passed off as the real thing, there are fortunes to be made and lost. For nearly a decade, two Englishmen did just that. Between them, they produced hundreds of modern masterpieces and plundered major art archives to fake their provenance. Their activities literally changed art history. It was one of the greatest frauds the art world has ever seen. How on earth did they get away with it for so long? Fall of 1995, out of the blue, a woman telephoned Scotland Yard with damning information about her former partner.
It wasn't the first time in my career that one received such a call from the woman scorned. Here was somebody who was clearly very upset at the breakup of her relationship, who had, in her words, a considerable amount of evidence to show that her husband, as she referred to him, had been involved in considerable criminal activity in the art market and had been orchestrating a major fraud.
Dick Ellis and another detective in the Art and Antique Squad met the woman at her local police station on October 5th, 1995. Her name was Bathsheba Goodsmith.
The two of us went and interviewed her, first of all, upstairs in the police station.
The bizarre story she told police uncovered a fraud that had been going on for 8 years. But Goodsmith had more damning evidence than the two detectives could have dreamt of.
And then she said, I've got quite a lot of exhibits for you.
She invited Jonathan and I to go round to a street in Hampstead where, in fact, her car was parked. And out of the boot of that car, she then produced several bin liner full of papers.
It was like an Aladdin's cave. Without those bin liners, we would have had very little evidence to go on.
The trash bags contained photographs, catalogs, and bills of sale. It wasn't certain what it all meant, but as Scotland Yard detectives began sifting through the material, one thing became clear. Somewhere in these trash bags was the key to one of the most extraordinary and audacious scams the art world had ever seen. And this was the man behind it, an Englishman called John Drew.
We very quickly formed an idea of John Drew, that he was an extremely intelligent and deep-thinking fraudsman.
This story goes back to the late 1970s, when London was the center of a thriving music industry. Soho was a magnet to anyone who thought they had the talent for writing a hit song. One of them was a former art student and budding composer called John Myatt. Myatt was taken on by a record company and was quite successful. He had a hit single called Silly Games. Everything seemed to be going well. Then one day, the man who ran the business arrived at work with a problem.
My boss at GTO Records had been out to dinner with Marcus Seif, and this Marcus Seif actually owned the whole of Marks and Spencer's. He came back the next day and he said, oh God, you know, I've seen these fantastic paintings by this artist called Raoul Dufy. This Marcus Seif, he's paid 90,000 for this one and 60,000 for the other. I said, they're brilliant. I wish I got something like that. I just happened to hear it. And I said, well, I could do that, Dick. Why don't you just let me do a couple of Dufys? So we went out, went around the art shops, got anything with Dufy on it. I said, well, that's nice and that's nice. Ooh, quite like that. He said, well, they've got to be bigger than Marcus Seif's. So I said, well, you know, 250 each then. Looking back on them, I mean, they were not very good, but they were good enough. He paid me £500 for the paintings, and then he went out and spent £600 each on the frames. And they hung them up. As you went in, you saw these gigantic doofies over the fireplace. And of course, Marcus and Lady Sif come back, walking through the door. And it's like, my doofies are bigger than your doofies. And no one had said anything about it, And Dick was sort of excited because really, I mean, he could have easily spent £200,000 on these paintings, but in fact, he got them for 500 quid, plus the frame.
John Myatt had been to art school, but this was the start of a new career. He set himself up in business as a legitimate forger of the modern masters.
I just thought, I can do this. It's genuine fakes. It's a good idea. Where can I put the advert up? What kind of people are going to be interested in this kind of thing? I'd always vaguely sort of, read Private Eye, and I thought, well, Private Eye's the place.
Private Eye is a small circulation satirical magazine with a caustic sense of humor. Myatt thought its readers might be the perfect clients.
I think altogether I put 3 adverts, maybe 4, in, and it got a good response.
It was not long before he received a telephone call from a man who would change his life.
The first phone call John Drew ever made to me was exactly the same as the first phone call that anybody else would. Hello, I've seen your advert in Private Eye. Are you interested in or familiar with an artist called Matisse? Well, of course I was. Yes. I'd be interested in a painting by Matisse. Who are you? He said, oh, my name is Professor Drew. I said, there is a painting by Matisse in my book. I think it's called The Pink Room or something. Does that sound all right to you? Yes, he said, that's good. It's a present from my wife.
John Myatt lived in the Midlands of England. It didn't take him long to complete his first commission for the mysterious Professor Drew. A few days later, he drove to his local railway station and caught a train to London to deliver his fake Matisse to his new client.
He said, I'll be standing at the top of the platform, whatever it would be, at Euston Station. And I said, well, you'll recognise me because I'll be the man carrying a painting. The very first time we met, we went to a little coffee shop in Euston, and he gave me a cheque and I went home.
At the time, Myatt was making a living as a part-time art teacher. His marriage had broken up, and he was taking care of 2 small children.
When a thing like that's happened and mum has just walked off, you really do close up into a very tight unit. There's just the 3 of you. And bedtime stories, and romping around, pillow fights and all that. It was great. I mean, looking back on it, I loved it.
Working at home, painting his genuine fakes suited the single father. Drew became a lucrative client, and Myatt grew to like him.
I thought he was very different from anybody else I'd met before. He was something else altogether. He was kind of mysterious and intriguing and exciting.
Every few weeks, Myatt would take the train to London to deliver another of his genuine fakes to his seemingly wealthy and influential buyer. John Myatt was soon taking the subway out to the affluent London suburb where Professor Drew lived.
By, say, the 5th time I'd met him, we were driving off to his house, and there I'd meet his wife, and then occasionally we'd drop off somewhere in Hampstead and pick up the 2 children from school. So by the 6th time I was seeing John, I was actually meeting his family as well. It just kind of grew slowly so that everybody got to know everybody else.
2 years passed, during which Drew bought a dozen paintings from Myatt. Then, just when Myatt thought the relationship with his patron was finally over, Drew had a surprising request.
At the end of the painting number 12 and number 13, he said to me, well, what would you like to do? It was unheard of for a customer to, to do that. So I said, well, I've always liked Cubist paintings. I love Cubism. Maybe I'll just do something like that. He said, okay, in your own time, very nice. Off you go, same money. So I flipped through an art book and I found a drawing, a Cubist drawing. I thought, well, I'll turn this into a painting. I know how to do this. On the dining room table that night, I, as they say, knocked up a small cubist work by Albert Glaze. That time I left, there wasn't another commission, and I got back on the train and I thought, well, that's it. That's goodbye, Professor Drew. Won't be hearing from him again. A couple of weeks later, maybe sooner, the phone rang and he said, John, you know that painting by Albert Glaze that you did for me? I said, yes, John. He said, well, I've just taken that into Christie's and Sotheby's and they think it's worth £25,000. Are you interested in, going halves with me and having £12,000 cash? And, that's when I made my big mistake, really, because, I didn't even stop and think about it. I just thought, £12,000, as far as I was concerned, was just the answer to so many problems. We could, the three of us could really do with that. So I said, yeah, I'll do it, yes. I think if we'd have stopped at that, that would just have been an episode in my life that I probably just have buried and forgotten about. But for some reason or other, I was sort of dissatisfied with the way my life was. You get to that stage when you're, how old I'd be about 40 then. You sort of think, well, is this all there is? Is this it? But in terms of what I was making with my life, I just felt as though the whole thing had fallen flat and was going nowhere.
Like it or not, John Myatt had allowed himself to be trapped by John Drew.
John Myatt came over as a very likeable man who seemed to have been suckered into this by John Drew at a vulnerable time in his life.
Myatt's just a mark. Myatt was the tool. Myatt was nothing more than a hammer, to pound the nail.
I think John Myatt was probably being groomed from the first order that John Drew made of him.
From his country retreat, John Myatt had now embarked on a life of crime.
Giacometti was next.
It was an obvious choice. Giacometti had been one of John Myatt's favorite painters since art school.
He used rapid movements of the pencil, almost like a skeleton. He wrote in his book that as he worked, the figure would sort of elongate and get bigger and get taller and taller, so it would sort of stretch out a bit more. People became like stick insects, really, very thin. And you usually have some kind of sense of the figure actually standing in sort of space. And that's largely how he drew. And when you've got that far into it, you're then ready to start a painting. I was so insulated from the fact that it was a crime going on here that I was kind of experimenting with my Giacometti technique, at the expense of being caught. And that was very peculiar. And the Giacomettis were, I would say, second-rate, maybe even third-rate fakes. Yet they got out there.
But the success of the scam depended only in part on the quality of John Myatt's paintings. John Drew had mastered a different kind of fake, and one which a gullible art market found much more impressive. He began changing the archives in some of London's biggest galleries and museums. How he did this was brilliant in its simplicity. In the museum archives, he would find a catalog belonging to a gallery that had gone out of business. This was the starting point for his cunning fraud.
Well, we found out that his research must have consisted on taking out catalogues from the archives and cutting and pasting and creating a collage catalogue and putting that back in to what was now a corrupted archive. These doctored catalogues consisted of photographs of genuine paintings and also photographs of fake paintings. He had juggled them, put them back in together. So you would have a catalogue which was just slightly changed, and you'd then have the same references but different pictures.
So when any would-be art historian went to those archives to check out a Myatt painting new on the market, lo and behold, there was everything there to suggest that this was something which had been around as they were being told in the provenance.
The painting's history, or provenance as it is called, was now impeccable. It appeared to all the world that the fake painting by Myatt had been part of an earlier exhibition or sale, and therefore indisputably genuine. Drew targeted some of London's most prestigious museums and galleries: the Institute of Contemporary Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and above all, Britain's foremost gallery of 20th century art, the Tate.
At the Tate, he must have been left alone in the archive room, which is a small room, on the occasional basis, and he must have been able to razor out from the catalogue a number of exhibition leaves or full exhibition catalogues. He then would say go to the lavatory, or if there was nobody in the room at the time, just pocket it. And then come back at a later date and reinsert and glue in the new doctored catalogue.
But at the same time as vandalizing the Tate's archive, Drew was presenting himself as a patron of the arts. He managed to persuade the most eminent people working at the Tate that he was a serious art connoisseur.
He was so in love with this idea of meeting all these posh and wealthy and establishment people and having one over on them, that in a way the money was the second most important thing. It was the doing of it that I learned from working with John, the being the professor, the mixing with all these people and knowing that you knew something that they didn't.
I think you could say a typical con man's relationship to the Tate Gallery. To get to where he wanted to be, he needed to, if you like, have a certain amount of influence with the Tate Gallery, and then to be able to bring that influence to bear in backing whatever he said about works of art, to give him some credibility in the art market.
But Drew's attempts to ingratiate himself to the Tate horrified the forger John Myatt.
I'd done some not very good paintings by a minor French artist from the 1950s, 1960s called Bissière. John had taken it into his head to present them to the Tate Gallery. So he said, would you come down as you'd love to see this. He said, why don't you come down as a consultant art historian? And, you know, so I kind of put my suit and tie on and went down and attended the meeting. They came up from wherever it was, and they had white gloves on. I mean, you really had to laugh. It was just so unreal. This one guy, I think he was the deputy head of it, he said, look, come down with me, Mr. Myatt, and I'll show you where we're going to hang these. So we went from this lovely boardroom into the gallery itself. And he said, no, we're going to have one this side there and one that side of the door there. And, you know, I thought, what can you say? I said, very good choice. And the only time I really got furious with John Drew, I really did. I thought, you know, do you want to get caught? What are you doing? The worrying thing from my point of view was that there was no oil paint on them. It was all emulsion paint. It was house paint. And there I was sitting in the boardroom of the bloody Tate Gallery with two paintings which had just been painted in emulsion paint. And they were saying, we're just going to take these down to conservation to have a look. And I thought, oh, Christ. You know, why does he do this?
Drew's tactics took great nerve, and there was method in his madness.
You might consider this as an odd move to do on a fraudman's side. But it's not. It's actually quite a clever thing to do, because if he can get the Bissière hung up in the Tate, it's literally 100% provenance, that you've got a genuine Bissier. And that's what he was trying to do.
We walked along Mill Bank and found some pub or other. That's where I had a crack at him. It's the only time I really did have a go at him, because I just felt, you're on a different planet here. This is just stupid. I think it made an impression on him. He said, well, what am I going to do then? I said, I don't know what you're going to do, but what you are going to do is you're going to get those paintings out of there.
John Drew came up with an extraordinary way out of the predicament. He would retrieve the forged paintings by giving the Tate a huge donation.
Came up with something that was a problem with the paintings. So he gave them £25,000 instead, and he got the paintings out. I got them back, and I burnt them. I was so relieved to have got them back. I put them on the bonfire and burnt the damn thing. I'd love to have them now, I must say. Those are the paintings that nearly made it into the Tate.
John Myatt and John Drew continued conning the art world, selling forgery after forgery into a seemingly insatiable market. Myatt could hardly believe he was getting away with it. After all, Myatt was only using household water-based paint mixed with petroleum jelly. Meanwhile, John Drew was cleverly doctoring Myatt's canvases to make them look older and more authentic.
He would then change the stretchers at the back. It was the first thing he did, usually, and put old stretchers on. Then he would also use furniture tacks, which he would treat with salt. And so that would corrode them, so they looked, nice and rusty around the edge. Perhaps put a bag of dust out of the hoover on the back of the thing, and then hoover it all off, so there was dust in the crevices. Just a bit of coffee or tea on the front, just to take the edge off it.
The technique seemed to be working, and Myatt's paintings were selling well. Little did they know that someone was onto them. In 1991, a painting came up for sale at Sotheby's, the prestigious auction house in London. The picture of a standing figure was apparently by Alberto Giacometti, one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. Myatt had spent the previous 4 years trying to perfect his Giacometti forgeries. It might sell for $300,000. But across the English Channel, in Paris, there were doubts about the authenticity of Myatt's Giacometti. American Mary Lisa Palmer lives and works in the French capital. She is one of the world's leading authorities on Giacometti. In November 1991, she received a copy of an auction catalog, and her suspicions were immediately aroused.
My first reaction in looking at the reproduction, it was wrong. There was something wrong. Let's say that in this painting there were several different elements that you can find in an authentic painting. But like you had a certain kind of background, you had a little sort of a sketch of what would be a canvas put against the wall on the side of the figure. You have the body of a standing woman. But the head, it looks like a head that Giacometti could have done, but it's a head of a man. So a head of a man and a female nude is sort of strange, And of course the signature was a bit thick and a bit too well applied.
Mary Lisa Palmer immediately flew to London. She examined the picture at Sotheby's and told the experts there what she thought.
Well, I told them that unfortunately that I thought that the painting was incorrect, and I asked them if they could give me an X-ray of the back, and they said, but Ms. Palmer, other people who know the work of Giacometti think it's fine, and on top of it, the provenance that is given in our auction catalog, you will find the proof of the pudding in the Tate archives.
Problem was that according to the Sotheby's catalog, The authenticity of the Giacometti was impeccable. Its provenance was listed in detail. Undeterred, Mary Lisa Palmer went straight to the Tate Gallery. As Sotheby's promised, she found a photograph of the dubious Giacometti in the Tate Gallery archive. But she came to a different conclusion. If the painting was fake, so too was the provenance.
What I discovered that day was that someone was tampering with the archives. This was extremely, extremely dangerous for the art world.
Mary Lisa Palmer's startling discovery raised more questions than it answered. How long had the scam been going on? How many other fakes were there? And by how many artists? And how was it that some of the best experts in the art world had been so totally duped? Among the many artists that Myatt was now forging was Ben Nicholson, a British artist producing abstract paintings after the Second World War.
I said to John Drew, Ben Nicholson would be a good choice because from his point of view, from the provenance point of view, he was English. So you didn't have to worry about provenancing things abroad.
Myatt set to work trying to master the seemingly simple process of producing a Ben Nicholson.
I tend to sort of stick with him from about 1950 to 1960. And during that period, he was kind of playing with a limited number of shapes which were based on jugs, goblets, mugs and things. When I was passing these off as fakes, I wasn't doing them as well as I am today. In fact, the things I'm doing today to the Nicholsons are much, much better. I struggled quite a lot at early days. It was really just a learning curve for me. Actually, this is quite a nice... I'm fed up of doing those now. Look, this is Henri Matisse.
To convince the experts of the authenticity of John Myatt's Nicholson fakes, they needed to know more about the way the artist worked.
I remember putting my best suit on and going to some Cork Street gallery or other which had got a Nicholson in the window and saying, can we have a look at that? And a very nice young lady came out and showed us the paintings, and we got a result. We knew what they looked like, where the gallery stickers were, where he'd signed them, on the stretcher actually, on the top right-hand side of the stretcher. And that was a vital and integral part of doing what we were doing, was knowing how that, how that worked.
John Myatt began turning out Nicholsons, while John Drew put the new information about the artist to good use.
Very good. I mean, he was quite a handy carpenter, that he used to make the frames in the same way that Nicholson made his frames. He got me to actually do the Ben Nicholson signature on the wooden stretcher at the back of the canvas.
It worked. Myatt's fakes passed the ultimate test.
The chilling thing, I think, was that these paintings would be shown to. In Ben Nicholson's case, I mean, Ben Nicholson's son-in-law, who had been a senior figure in a very important British gallery, was saying, oh yes, authenticating these paintings.
As John Myatt was churning out the fakes at home, unknown to him, John Drew had made contact with the police, but about something quite different and much more sinister.
We met at the Battersea heliport, where this character came in by helicopter, and it was John Drew. And he had his two children, and of course the pilot and co-pilot of this helicopter he had hired for the day just to impress the detectives from Scotland Yard. And he came through with this long story of how he was a professor of this, that, or the other, and how he came across these mafiosi trying to sell stolen paintings and so forth.
From the start, Charlie Hill had his doubts about the man who was offering himself as a police informant on the Italian mafia, especially when Drew invited him to a restaurant that Charlie Hill understood to be a hub of mafia activity. In retrospect, what John Drew was up to became perfectly clear to the Scotland Yard detective.
He realized that he was about to be revealed as a con man and a fraudster, and he wanted to get himself a coup as a police informant, so he could use that as a line of defense.
There were plenty of other people who were taken in by John Drew, and art experts who fell for John Myatt's fakes. In 1994, a man called Clive Bellman walked into the gallery of a private art dealer, Peter Nahum. Nahum had spent years working for Sotheby's auction house. He now had a substantial reputation as a dealer specializing in 19th and 20th century painting.
When Clive Bellman came to us, we were in the middle of the deepest recessions in the art trade. And he explained a few things. We'd never met him before. He'd explained that the reason he was selling these pictures, which belonged to his neighbor, which was a private collection, was that he had owned a couple of jewelry shops, etc., and gone bust. Now, we feel great sympathy for people who have lost their businesses. To take him on face value, you'd have been perfectly happy with it. I'm very sensitive to shifty people, and Clive Bellman did not appear to be shifty to me.
The painting Bellman was trying to sell was by Graham Sutherland, the provenance from an Italian monastery.
I didn't like the painting at all. I thought it was dreadful. But Christie's had just sold a group of these paintings with the same provenance from the same monastery for a great deal of money.
Little did Peter Nahum know that the painting was a fake by John Myatt, the provenances forged by John Drew.
One of the Sutherlands that we got, a beautiful Graham Sutherland crucifixion, and John Myatt just did the same crucifixion, but with a different color. And instead of having yellows, there was reds. Both of them Graham Sutherland colors, the specific red that Sutherland used. Beautiful little jewel of a painting. What Drew had done, he'd gone to a monastic order, and he had told them that he had got from one of the sales of their books a whole load of Graham Sutherland paintings. He then got a stamp cut with Order of Servite Mary, which approximated to the stamp that they actually did have, and he stamped the paintings.
Peter Nahum took the provenance of the Sutherland at face value, paid Clive Bellman $7,000 for the painting, and put it in a Christie's auction.
Well, they put an estimate of £10,000 to £15,000 on it. It was unsold. We still have it, or the police have it.
Peter Nahum was another victim of the scam Drew had launched on an unsuspecting art world. But so too was Clive Bellman. And he wasn't the only innocent recruited by John Drew.
As with all con men, they use people, they get out of them what they need, and then they discard them. There's no support, there's no loyalty. They are users and abusers, and that's exactly what John Drew was.
He told all his friends and acquaintances that these were perfectly genuine paintings, that some of them he had inherited. He used people who weren't crooks. He used straightforward people who were not involved in crime to present his numerous paintings at the various auction houses. He stayed in the background. He would send out runners he couldn't be seen in too many places at once.
By this time, the gloss was already beginning to go off the criminal life for John Myatt. He went along to the sale of some of his fakes of Jean Dubuffet at a London auction house.
For whatever reason, he couldn't go, and he said, would I go to this auction of Dubuffets? And I did. I had the same kind of feeling, actually. Every time I got to the sharp end of what was going on, I really didn't like it. I think they got about 40,000 or 50,000 altogether, these things. I walked up King Street and then up the Strand and back towards Piccadilly, and I thought, well, this is the point where I really should feel happy. This is where, you roll credits and everybody lives happily ever after. I thought, why do I feel so fed up with everything?
John Myatt finally decided he had had enough.
He called up one day from a telephone, and I said, John, you've just got off. I can't be doing this anymore. Off. And he said, did you just tell me to off? And I said, yes, yeah, John. And down went the phone. And I remember going, that's that. That's that. Knife, fork, spoon and knife. Done it.
As the relationship between the two men deteriorated, what neither John Drew nor John Myatt knew was that their forgery scam was about to be rumbled. When Clive Bellman paid his next visit to Peter Nahum, he arrived at the gallery with a painting by Ben Nicholson.
It came with full provenance, labels on the back, a catalogue in which it was exhibited at the Rue de Seine or one of these non-existent galleries, some gallery in the 1950s. It came with a certificate from the Ben Nicholson expert, who was the ex-director of the Tate Gallery. I decided to buy it with somebody else, a friend of mine. This picture wasn't a great Ben Nicholson, but it was quite colourful. We thought it was absolutely genuine. We did not think it was good enough to offer to our clients, but we thought it was the sort of picture that clients of Sotheby's and Christie's, because it was colourful, would pay good money for. So we bought it as a purely commercial transaction.
Nahum even took the painting to the curator at London's Tate Gallery, who had recently mounted a Nicholson exhibition.
He privately said, it's not a great one, but it's okay.
Nahum and his partner put the painting into an auction at Sotheby's in New York and sold it at a $15,000 loss.
We are now at the point where we have bought two pictures, two Myatts Drew pictures, and we believe them both to be genuine. One is waiting for sale in Christie's, one's been sold in Sotheby's.
Some while later, Nahum was offered a second Ben Nicholson by a man claiming to be raising money for a charity representing the victims of the Auschwitz concentration camp.
My partner on the other Ben Nicholson and I are looking at this Ben Nicholson, beautifully signed on the back, in Ben Nicholson's handwriting in pencil, exactly as he does. It has all the paperwork, a catalogue with it illustrated in from the 1950s. And we're looking at the picture, and the scales start falling from our eyes because there are labels, gallery labels on the back, provenance labels. And we think, this Ben Nicholson has exactly the same provenance and gallery labels as the previous one we had. Now, what are the chances of that? No, not very. And then we think, well, this is a bit of a worry. So then we look at the signature, beautifully written. Once you realize the handwriting starts falling apart. Brilliant, but you realize not quite good enough. I had put the whole scam together, and I put all the documentation together, and I called in the police.
He believed that these were probably two sources that were linked. He showed me letters that he'd received, and from his professional viewpoint, having looked at the paintings further, he considered they were probably by the same hand. So we were looking at a sort of well-versed fraud with a forger working behind it.
Peter Nahum had worked out that the Sutherland also was a fake, but he did have a name for us, and that name was came back to Drew.
Within days, John Drew's name came up again.
The next piece of the jigsaw actually sort of fell into place very quickly.
Dick Ellis got a call at Scotland Yard from the man who ran the Tate Gallery.
He was concerned that he'd been talking to people within their archives, that they had a problem within the archive, that somebody who had donated a large sum of money to them, £20,000, and as a result had sort of been given the key of the door, could have now caused some damage to the archives, actually been utilising them to mastermind a fraud. And of course, the name John Drew was thrown in again.
The last piece of the jigsaw puzzle came with the dramatic visit to the police of John Drew's estranged partner. With the contents of the trash bags now under police examination, the 8 years of fraud and fakes was about to come to an end.
In the bin liners, the most prevalent thing was negatives. Hundreds of negatives of a number of different artists. We had Giacomettis, we had de Styles, we had Bessières, we had Jarlenskis, Ivor Klums, Dubuffets. It covered at least 30 to 40 artists. You name it, the 20th century moderns were there.
It became pretty clear that there was all the indications of not just a large-scale fraud. I think we'd all seen that before. But there was evidence there that archives, and not just from the Tate Gallery, but from other galleries, had been cut up, had been copied. And clearly this was of great concern to the art world, that where they go for their historic records had now been contaminated in this way.
The first stop for the police as they began to unravel the extent of the fraud was once again the Tate Gallery.
Told the Tate that we had an interest in Giacomettis because we got a large amount of Giacomettis. We worked out, in fact, in the end there were between 20 and 30 Giacomettis which had been done. And we wanted to know the Giacometti expert, and we were put on to Mary Lisa Palmer.
In Paris, Mary Lisa Palmer had been waiting 4 years for this moment.
Finally, we arranged that we go to London with all of our documents, which weighed quite a few pounds.
Within a week, Palmer was sitting in Scotland Yard, telling detectives which paintings were genuine and which were not. The trash bags also gave police the name of John Myatt as the forger. Early in September 1995, they raided his home. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when Jonathan Searle and a team of officers from Scotland Yard arrive at John Myatt's home deep in the English countryside.
I was in bed, and I opened the bedroom window and looked down at the path, and there they all were.
I think he was half expecting a call from police. He knew it would come down the line someday or another.
And when they said, "This is Scotland Yard Arts and Antiques Squad, we have a search warrant for these premises," yeah, I just sort of went, click, that's it. You know, everything else is in the past now. This is a whole new thing from now on. Awful, terrible.
He put up his hands at once, and he wanted to come alongside.
And they came in, and I remember saying, well, have a look around. And funnily enough, there was a drawing of Sam on the wall.
As soon as I walked into the kitchen, I saw a drawing on the by the fridge, which had got telephone numbers written on it. And I knew, this man can draw. If he can draw, he's probably a good enough artist. Then I looked up the stairs and I saw a Giacometti, and we were there.
I showed them all over the house. They took paintings and they took books and I got a Giacometti up on the wall. They took that. Sam came downstairs and said, "Dad, who are all these people?" I said, "Oh, don't worry, Sam, they're building inspectors. The house is freezing cold and they're going to put a central heating in or something." So I said, "You just get on and do what you do. I'm going to stand outside and wait for the school bus." So I got Sam on the bus and came in. And they didn't make too much mess. They took filing cabinets and all the rest of it. And they said, "Well, you'd have to come across to the police station in Stafford." And all the time I'm thinking, damn this. And I'm sort of cross and also frightened. And I've never dealt with police in my life, really.
We took all the paintings that we found, and there were a number of other bits and pieces, and we took them back to Stafford Police Station, and we did an interview under caution there.
Yes, I do know John Drew, and yes, I have painted some paintings for him.
John Myatt knew the game was up, especially when confronted with a particularly incriminating piece of evidence.
They'd confiscated my briefcase, and in this briefcase they'd got this letter, and this was a letter I'd written to John Drew saying, I think it's best that we stop doing what we're doing because, you know, I'm fed up with it and da-da-da-da-da. And he said, what's this letter? You're fed, you don't want to work with John Drew anymore. What do you mean you don't want to work with John Drew? And I said, well, I was kind of spluttering and thinking, God, and they're saying, oh, this thing's being, you know, it's being taped all the time. So they went on and they started telling me what they thought Mr. Drew had been up to, and what they thought I'd been up to. And it became pretty clear that they knew more about me than I did, and more about him than he did. They knew everything, pretty much.
As soon as we had an interview with John Myatt, we knew exactly where we were going. We knew the depth of the problem. We knew we had, for example, approximately 200 fakes covering a large miscellany of artists.
Myatt may have confessed, but it would still take time to nail John Drew.
John Drew was a much harder nut to crack on this.
As the police homed in on Drew, the focus of their inquiry moved across the Atlantic. A reputable New York art dealer named Armand Bartos had a Giacometti, standing nude 1955, that he wanted to sell. A year earlier, he had approached Mary Lisa Palmer, asking her to authenticate the painting.
For me, it was simple in a sense. For me, the painting was fake, therefore everything was fake. But then I had to prove it to people who didn't want to believe it.
Palmer warned Bartos to be extremely cautious about the painting. She had, after all, already exposed one fake Giacometti. She played for time while she did more research. Meanwhile, Armand Bartos had decided to get his own confirmation of the provenance of his Giacometti. He hired a company called Art Research Associates to investigate the authenticity of the provenance. Little did he know that the man he was paying from Art Research Associates was none other than John Drew, the man who had forged the provenances in the first place. Armand Bartos flew to London and met Drew at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Mary Lisa Palmer heard about the Bartos visit and tipped off the police, who monitored the encounter.
It was a very sweet sting because not only had he sold through intermediaries Armand Bartos a Giacometti nu debout, but now he was showing him his forgeries to bolster up his claim that this was a genuine. And this shows that an honest dealer like Armand Bartos can easily be taken in by the fact that these are cast iron provenances, and the provenances were very, very good.
After the meeting, police broke the news to Bartos that he had been duped by Drew.
The poor man was not very happy. He was, I believe, quite angry at the time. In fact, furious, understandably.
Police decided it was time to pull in John Drew. Within days, they raided his house in a wealthy town 20 miles from London.
John Drew was very polite, courteous.
The surprising thing to me was the amount of evidence that he had still got in his possession, incriminating evidence in terms of the seals which we had seen on various documents he'd created. We found the seals, typewriters that he used. Even on the table in the living room were sets of documents that he was in the process of actually preparing. A huge amount of documentary evidence, material objects had been preserved.
Drew was taken to the local police station where he denied everything.
He came across as somebody who could quite convincingly call black white and white black. He accepted and took on board all the exhibits at once, but then proceeded to tell us that they were all genuine.
At the end of it, he invited us all out for a drink on the grounds of how nice we'd been and pleasant.
The 4-month trial ended in London in February 1999. Drew conducted his own defense.
It had its moments of sheer farce when I would turn around to him and say, what the hell are you doing, John? You know, I mean, I know you're guilty, you know you're guilty, they know you're guilty, everybody knows you're guilty, so why don't you just plead? And the judge would say, Mr. Myatt, would you please answer Mr. Drew's question? I couldn't see the point. We were going to get found guilty. We were guilty. We were probably going to go to prison. The best thing to do was just, you know, straighten up your shoulders, get your thumbs in line with the seam of your trousers, and just take it on the chin. There was nothing else to do.
John Myatt pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. John Drew maintained his innocence throughout, but he was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. 5 years after leaving jail, John Myatt had an exhibition in London's Mayfair, the home of the art establishment, where his fakes had deceived so many for so long.
I've got a show in central London, the heart of enemy territory. What am I going to do? We had a dealer walking around here earlier on, and he was obviously a dealer, you know, the pinstripe suit and almost, not quite the dicky bow, but everything, the cashmere coat and so forth. And he walked around with his hands behind his back, you know, and he just went out and he looked at the little Matisse down there and he said, jolly good Matisse, you know, and off he went. Very nice.
Even the police responsible for his demise wanted a genuine Myatt. Jonathan Searle asked him to paint a family portrait.
She said, yes, I'll do that for you. And commissioned it for £1,000.
And Charlie Hill has a Myatt too.
He sent this to me last week, to Charlie Hill from John Myatt. Very best wishes for 2006 and beyond. And he has signed it as John Myatt rather than as Magritte. It's amusing and it's well done, and I like the man a great deal.
The exhibition was a sellout, and John Myatt thinks he knows why.
Most people have come in the right kind of spirit, which is that it's a bit of fun, it's a bit of a laugh. You know, looking at a fake painting is a liberating experience. You don't have to pretend to like a fake painting, because it says, hello, I'm a fake painting. And you say, ooh, you might not go with the curtains, or, you know, my wife might not like that kind of little red blob in the corner. You can't say that to a Van Gogh or a Monet, because they're worth 25 or 30 million pounds. So it kind of liberates you to, you know, make your own judgment. Trust your own judgment.
But how much damage was done by Myatt and Drew in their years of fraud and forgery?
The most damaging aspect is that John Drew literally created and changed art history by literally planting fake provenances in the archives. So he changed the body of work of Giacometti and the other artists that Myatt faked, and really damaging the sense of history and legacy.
Of the 200 or so Myatt fakes, only 72 have ever been found.
24 Graham Southern crucifixes, the 20 to 30 Giacomettis, a number of Ben Nicholsons, about 24, a number of Chagalls. We recovered a clay, a small drawing, quite a pretty little drawing, 5 Dubuffets, and so on.
John Myatt, though, has no intention of letting on now which paintings are genuine and which are Myatt fakes.
They're out there, and they will blossom and flourish as leaves on a tree. Why not? If anybody came back to me with one that I'd done, and after 20 years, I honestly wouldn't know for certain, but I thought I had, I would always say, no, I haven't seen this. You know, if you come to me with one and say, oh, did you paint this 20 years ago? And I said, yes. All that's happened is that you've lost a fortune. So what's the point? What is the point?